Yes. Hello.
Okay.
Hello.
Good evening. Good evening.
Good evening.
Hello.
Nice to meet you here.
Thank you. The same to you.
Okay. Now we have all the three speakers here, and I'd like to begin this session now. This is actually the fourth panel of this seminar. The topic, theme of this panel of this session is challenges to the health system, society, and the law. And here we have three very professional and distinguished speakers here. They are Professor Liu Jindong from Institute of International Law, China's Academy of Social Sciences. He's a senior research fellow of the institute, and he's going to talk about global public health governance and international rule of law. And we have Dr. Jose Nabor Cruz Marcelo, professor of the Institute for Economic Research, National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, and he's going to talk about the impact of the COVID-19 health contingency and the deficiencies of health and social securities in Mexico. And last but not least, we have Professor Laura Fleming Gomez. She's professor of the Center for International Studies, College of Mexico. She's going to talk about the health system in Mexico facing COVID-19. And I am the chair of this session. I'm Liao Fan. I'm a senior research fellow and a deputy director general of the Bureau of International Cooperation of CAS. And I'm very glad to be able to chair this session and to introduce our three speakers to the audience. Basically, we will, you three colleagues will talk one by one, and each of you will have 15 minutes to talk. And I would like to encourage you to keep the time, and I will remind you when there are 2 or 3 minutes left, so that we can have more time to discuss and exchange things. And after all of you have finished your presentation, we will have 30 minutes of Q&A or discussion. And during this period, we can welcome questions from the audience, and you speakers are also encouraged to discuss among yourselves. So 15 minutes for each speaker and 30 minutes of discussion. That's all for this session. So first, let's welcome Professor Liu Jindong from Institute of International Law, CAS, to talk about global public health governance and international rule of law. Welcome, Professor Liu.
Yeah, thank you, moderator, my friend, Professor Liao. Professor Cruz, Professor Flemont, hello, good morning for Chinese colleagues, and good evening for you. Yeah, it's my great pleasure to be invited to attend this very important seminar and deliver my speech. My today's speech focus on the global public health governance and international rule of law. Since public health issues are related to the life and the health of all mankind and are of tremendous importance to international peace and development, the World Health Organization, we know the WHO, the first specialized international organizations established after the founding of the United Nations, aims to further strengthen international governance in the field of public health concerning human life and health. The establishment of WHO marks a new development stage of international health governance. With the active participation of developing countries, the coverage of international health law has expanded unprecedentedly, which overcome the historical defects and enable the developing countries to enjoy the benefits brought by the progress of human medical science and technologies. However, compared with the health legislation activities in nearly half a century before World War II, The international health legislation after the establishment of WHO is seriously insufficient. In the past 70 years, only 2 international treaties have been created. Namely, the first is the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and the Convention on Medical Terminology. The implementation of the former convention, FCTC, is not satisfactory in practices, and the latter one is purely a technical norm. Only 2 treaties have been created in nearly 70 years. Although the international health regulation, the core International Convention on the Prevention and Control of Infectious Disease has been revised several times, but the legal binding force and the mandatory enforcement mechanism of the rules thereof are still lacking, which leads WHO's ability to be inconsistent with this ambition when confronted with Ebola, AIDS, SARS, and COVID-19, which is spreading all over the world currently. The authority of the WHO has not been demonstrated. Countries act on their own, and disputes continue to arise. The WHO faces increasing blame and criticism from all sides, and the calls for enforcing this international rule of law get louder. There are many factors leading to the defects of international rule of law in global public health governance. With the unprecedented expansion of the scope of international public health regulations, the great progress of science and technology in medicine and epidemic containing, and the higher expectation the international community has of international health organizations and their corresponding legal regimes, the capability building of the WHO has unfortunately failed to live up to the requirements of the times properly and sufficiently. Some countries and regions, for their own interest, have attached much emphasis upon regional power, but turned a blind eye to global public health governance. Nevertheless, the most essential reason lies in the personnel structure and the driving force of the WHO. For a long time, we know, for a long time after WHO establishment, this institution, WHO, has been led by medical experts, adhered to the guideline of medical technology. Whereas seriously overlooked the role of international law and international truth in international health governance. We know in WHO, there are very few international law experts and lawyers, let alone playing an important role. The international rule of law in global health governance is considerably inadequate. After the establishment of WHO, the scope and coverage of global public health governance is beyond that of any other international health organization before World War II. This is of decisive significance for the prevention and control of global disease, promotion of human health and life, improvement of medical and health conditions in many countries, especially in developing countries. However, long-term neglect of rule of law in the field of international public health has led to serious consequences. After the outbreak of the pandemic in 2020, WHO and its legal system are facing a great challenge again. People of insight all around the globe are thinking about how to overcome these difficulties and get international public health governance truly embark on the track of rule of law. In the face of COVID-19 coming all of a sudden, WHO has failed to impose restrictions on some countries' conducts, including ignoring WHO's recommendation and guidelines, refusing international cooperation, holding drugs and epidemic prevention materials, and attempting to monopolize the manufacture and sale of vaccine, which seriously interferes with pandemic prevention and control and pose extremely urgent challenge to global public health governance, especially developing countries' people's health. Therefore, we have the following 3 suggestions. Firstly, international health regulations should be amended as soon as possible to enhance its legal binding force. The IHR contains the rules of international law dealing with public health emergencies worldwide, but it lacks mandatory legal binding force now. In particular, vigorous and compulsory legal rules should be established with regards to the reporting of public health emergency, the recommendation for health measures to be adopted, international restrictions, and the distribution of utilization of vaccines. Besides, a set of effective legal mechanisms need to be created to authorize the WHO to supervise the implementation of the IHR by these member states and to resolve related disputes which could possibly arise among the members. Secondly, the coordination of rules with WHO, IMF, and WIPO should be accelerated, and unified international legal system with harmonized international health law, trade rules, and financial regulations should be built. The WHO should facilitate communication and contact with other international organizations like WTO, IMF, and WIPO, setting up corresponding working mechanism, regularly consulting on the rules of international law concerning human health in order to realize the unification and coordination among international legal rules with respect to trade, finance, intellectual property rights, and health. Prohibit countries from taking trade restrictions measures on important epidemic prevention material, medical devices, medicine, and vaccine. Prevent IP powers from improper monopoly of wearable drugs and vaccine, and make the international financial rules meet up the actual needs of global epidemic prevention and economic recovery. Thirdly, and lastly, the international legal constraints should be strengthened in terms of technical assistance and preferential measures for developing countries. Legal rules in the field of global public health governance have been lacking compulsory legal force with regards to technical assistance to the developing countries. And the availability of drugs, epidemic prevention materials, and vaccines therein, resulting in the failure of developed countries to fulfill their due international obligations to developing countries. This situation should be changed. Specifically, the WHO should properly formulate a protocol on technical assistance, the availability of medicine, epidemic containing materials, and vaccine for developing countries, clarifying the technical assistance obligation of the developed country and the preferential measures for the developing countries, and endure the developed countries with strict legal binding force so as to ensure fair and equitable treatment of developing countries in global public health governance. Thank you for your attention. And I look forward to communicate with all panelists on this topic. Thank you. Hello, moderator.
Apparently, he lost his connection.
Yeah. I can't
So,
the moderator's voice.
If Professor Cruz agrees, we can continue with his talk.
Maybe we wait a minute.
For me, it's no problem. I can continue.
Hello, Leo. Oh,
We lost
him.
I suggest we wait a few minutes to the moderator. Okay. Okay.
Aquí es acá.
Yeah. Hello. No. I cannot hear your voice. Hello.
We can hear.
No. You say something, Professor Liao. No.
See?
Maybe the computer have some problem.
The connection is not very stable.
Yeah. Okay. That's
You can hear me
okay.
now?
Yeah.
Great.
I have
Okay.
finished my speech. I have finished my speech.
Yeah,
Thank you, moderator. Thank you, Professor Liao.
Yeah. Many
I
thanks,
look
Professor
forward
Liu.
to communicate with other panelists on this topic. Thank you.
Okay. Many thanks, Professor Liu, for your perfect presentation and also your perfect timing, because you have not only kept the time, but also saved 3 minutes for us, actually. So I appreciate that. And I'm particularly interested in your discussion about the coordination of the rules between international health law and the WTO IMF rules, and also the sort of in the empowerment of the developing countries in terms of technical assistance, their preferential treatment. And since you're also an expert on WTO law, I'd like to hear your insight in how to, ensure this thing to happen, because as we know now in WTO, there is a heated debate about the developing country status. So I'd like to hear your insight during the discussion session. So now let's welcome our second speaker, Professor Cruz, to make his presentation on the topic of the impact of COVID-19 health contingency and the deficiencies of health and social security in Mexico. Welcome, Professor Cruz.
Thank you, Professor Fan. Good evening to Latin America audience. Good morning to China audience. I would like to thank the organizer for inviting Coneval. I will present a conference named The Impact of COVID-19 Contingency on Health and Social Security Deficiencies in Mexico. Okay. I will start with a little normative background. In 2004, it was decided to have an official poverty measurement in Mexico, defined as a multidimensional concept. Various experts on the field was invited to the discussion. The Congress approved the General Law of Social Development in that same year. This law is the origin of Coneval, and it mandated its creation, and it also pointed to the main charges of the multidimensional poverty measurement that must be carried out in the country. Specifically, not only does this law mandate the newly created Coneval to measure poverty and evaluate social programs, but also enumerates all social rights included in multidimensional poverty measurement. As many of you know, Mexico was the first country to take an official multidimensional poverty measurement for policymakers. The General Law of Social Development provided the foundation for an institutional measurement of poverty, as well as its main guidelines such as dimension, income and social deprivation, a periodicity of calculation, and a territorial disaggregation. It also means an upgrade from early conceptualization and definition of poverty. Furthermore, it provided a solid ground for the adaptation of the multidimensional poverty approach in Mexico. Finally, Coneval's academic board agreed the Multidimensional Poverty Index, MPI, which we have been using for the past 10 years. Its methodology consists of two broad analytical dimensions. On the one hand, economic well-being measured through per capita household income, and the other hand, social right deprivation, all of which are universal human rights warranted by our political constitution. This means that you can think on the Mexican MPI in terms of two axes, one of which is economic well-being, while the other involves social deprivations. From the most recent multidimensional poverty data from Mexico to 2018, Coneval estimates 9.3 million people live in extreme poverty. 52.4 million people live in poverty. Out of 125 million people, only 27.4 million belong to non-poor and non-vulnerable population. Additionally, in terms of deprivations, 20 million people report a lack of health service. Finally, the largest need reported is the lack of social security, up to 71 million people in 2018. This closely relates to the high presence of informal jobs in the Mexican labor market. As I have already explained, the multidimensional measurement of poverty for Mexico is reported every 2 years. The next measurement for 2020 will be published in May 2021. However, intermediate information on poverty is always needed. In the interval between the reports, Coneval tracks the evolution of the population economic well-being by monitoring labor income. Labor income share represents 70% of total income per capita. The best available source of which labor poverty estimation is based is the quarterly information on labor income of households report by Inequalities, National Survey of Occupation and Labor. Therefore, Coneval developed an indicator of labor poverty on quarterly basis to indicate the evolution of the labor income of the Mexican population. This is the Labor Poverty Trend Index. What is the Labor Poverty Trend Index? What does it help us explain? It expresses the percentage of population with income below a basic food basket cost, which means the percentage of population that is not able to purchase all of the food basket goods, even if they spend their entire household labor income. If labor income increased more than the food basket cost, the household's purchasing power improves and consequently, the labor poverty trend index decreases. According to the estimate of labor poverty by Coneval, between the fourth quarter of 2018 and the first quarter of 2020, prior to the COVID-19 health contingency, labor poverty went down from 40% to 35.7%. That's a reduction of almost 5 basis points. The reduction was due to several factors, whose stable inflation and the sustained increase of minimum wage within the period. However, starting in April from this year, due to quarantine difficulties, INEGI developed the telephonic survey of occupation and employment, which has much smaller sample substitute for the non-face-to-face survey. Coneval estimate from this telephonic survey indicate that the greatest increase of labor poverty was registered for the month of May, with 55% of the survey population. However, a notable reduction of this percentage was observed during the month of June, due to the first measurement of economic reopening. Labor poverty points back to 18.1% of occupied population. Next November, new data about the Mexican labor market will be published for the third quarter of this year. So far, the data of labor poverty to Coneval has estimated from official sources, confirmed some hypotheses that we raised in May in an institutional working document. The reduction of formal jobs will have a negative effect on health and social security with long-lasting deficiencies. Informal workers represent 56.2% of the employed population. This population does not have social security, and they are more vulnerable. Meaningfully, 13.5 million subordinate workers do not have social security and remain in a situation of poverty. They work in the most exposed sectors to pandemic risk, and they also represent a majority of those employed in these exposed sectors, such as accommodation, service, restaurants, cleaning, and commerce. Coneval is not only in charge of the official poverty measurement. It also evaluates all social development programs at the national, state, and municipality levels. Therefore, Coneval also analyzed the risk of the pandemic caused on various vulnerable groups. In this specific case, we analyzed the possible effects on Mexican women. In 2018, 79.7% of indigenous women in rural areas are in poverty. This represents a risk of increased vulnerability for women living in poverty. We also point out of decrease in income and increasing exposure of women engaged with paid domestic work due to the absence of labor regulation. We agree that extraordinary measures are required to face the health emergency. The federal government has provided additional action to the social development programs. They are still in operation to end the contingency. Prevention and care of the health emergency. This includes the measures undertaken by the public health system, support for Mexican households and business with an emphasis on the most vulnerable. These measures are related to the income and liquidity of the most vulnerable people and companies, particularly those that face difficulties in accessing the formal financial system. Support to state and local governments. Action aimed at state and local government to provide financial resources to face the health emergency with greater opportunity by advancing transfers in April on May from this year. Consideration to the attention and vulnerable groups facing the health emergency in the short term. Proper operation. The proper operation and no suspension of federal programs that carry out direct cash transfer must be ensured. Coordination of the three government branches. Coordinated measures are required on the three government levels getting involved to promote the households that could have income difficulties can satisfy the most basic needs. For example, through temporary subsidies in the costs of the basic housing service. Other measures that could be adopted are guaranteeing the operation of the Social Milk Supply Program, the CONSA in Spanish, and the Rural Supply Program, the CONSA. Promoting agricultural production in the country through the Special Corn Program for Sustainable Rural Development. Most of the high priority programs are centered on territorial level and are generally based on the following criteria. High and very high marginalization, municipalities where indigenous population reside, areas of the greatest violence. In this regard, in the design evaluation with fieldwork 2019-2020, the following aspects were identified. Prioritizing by territory facilitates operational deployment. In territories of high and very high marginalization, there are maybe people with different poverty levels. It is necessary to design priority criteria that allows to providing population in territory to generate certain in favor of the beneficiaries. At this point, I will present some main conclusions because it's important to reflect on medium and long-term consideration. Also, the cash transfer provided by social programs are necessary. It is essential to consider them as temporary measures and to promote reflection on the new complexity of the problems that the population will face, and therefore, the public programs that are required to address these issues effectively. It's necessary to build a social protection system that ensures universal access to health and that protects the exercise of all Mexican social rights, which is adequate for the different condition of the population and stage of life. Given the prevalence of long-term institutionalized measures that guarantee security against risks, it is considered necessary to analyze the viability of the available policy mechanisms, among which are the following. Contributory employment ensure that does not affect retirement pensions, the implementation of additional protection mechanisms that will require a progressive fiscal reform to guarantee their financial or greater reallocation of resources and the cancellation of non-priority projects. This situation should also be considered. Finally, thank you very much for your attention. And as Coneval Moro says, what can be measured can be improved. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Cruz. You also saved more 1.5 minutes actually for the discussion. And I'm quite impressed by your presentation because actually COVID-19, the impact of COVID-19 is widespread and far-reaching. Nobody can escape. But as you have pointed out, actually, it have stricken most on the vulnerable groups and the poor people. So it's time, although I mean the epidemic is not yet over, but it's time to think how we can help them efficiently. But I actually have a question that maybe we can discuss during the Q&A session. Actually, now most countries are facing the challenges of a recession, and they have the big task of recovering the economy. And actually, those kind of aid, assistance, and healthcare, this kind of things, assistance to the vulnerable groups, they do come with cost. Even during the normal time, actually, they kind of have a financial burden on the government. So during this special period, when countries are fighting to recover the economy, how we can sort of coordinate the tasks of recovering the economy during this recession, and to help those people in need, those vulnerable groups, those poor people, how we can sort of make a kind of policy priority and policy design to sort of ensure these two aspects be met together. So that's my what I had in mind when I have heard your presentation. So we can discuss it during later. So now I'm honored to introduce Professor Fleiman from the College of Mexico to speak on the health system in Mexico facing COVID-19. So welcome, Professor Fleiman. Professor Fleiman, okay, now.
Thank you very much. Well, I would like to start by thanking the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, UNAM, the National University of Mexico, and El Colegio de Mexico for inviting me to this panel. Also, my thanks to Professor Liu and Professor Cruz for sharing the panel with me. And I'm going to talk about one specific issue that Professor Cruz already suggested, which is healthcare in Mexico. And I'm going to be a little bit ambitious because I'm going to try to touch upon 3 points, which are the inequalities that characterize healthcare protection in Mexico, to start with. Then the centralizing reform of the current president, President López Obrador, in this area. And finally, how this has all interacted with COVID and federalism in Mexico. And I would like to start pointing out that nowadays, Mexico is facing 2 crises, as the rest of the world, the health and economic crisis derived from COVID-19. But in addition, we're also in a very severe crisis regarding an institutional crisis, I would call it, regarding the public health system in Mexico. So I'm going to start by touching very briefly, and I have to be very schematic because of the time we have available. I'm going to start talking about how healthcare protection in Mexico is rather unequal across subsystems and regions, and I'll give some evidence regarding that point. Then I'll talk about the healthcare reform of 2020, which started January the 1st with the current government of President López Obrador, briefly about the creation of a new institution, INSABI, and how this is a centralizing reform. And finally, very rapidly, I'm going to touch on the combination of these 3 crises: COVID-19, health policy, and federalism in Mexico. So bear with me because I'll have to explain some details about how healthcare protection functions in Mexico. I'll try to be as clear as possible, and I'll try to do it very rapidly in order to move to the more substantive and new reform of President López Obrador. So, grossly speaking, Mexico has 2 different manners of protecting healthcare publicly. The first subsystem has to do with the uninsured people, those people who have no social security. Those systems are paid with taxes, general taxes, and user fees. The other subsystem has to do with those who have social security. And this is the traditional Bismarck model of contributive social security in which the employee, the employer, and the government contribute. Now, regarding the uninsured subsystem, this has changed quite a bit since the 1940s, and up to date, while the provision of Social Security in Mexico has more or less kept the same format that we adopted in the 40s. So there's also private services, which are very interesting, but I don't have the time to talk about those now. So at the beginning, it was the Department of Health, the one that was in charge of providing, taking care of the health of uninsured people. And this was a decentralized system. Then later, in 79, roughly, a new program was created to provide health to the poorest of the poorest. This is called, was called IMSS Oportunidades, IMSS Bienestar nowadays, created in 79, a centralized system as well. Later on, in 2003, shortly after the first democratic election we had at the federal level with President Fox, Seguro Popular was created, a popular insurance system, decentralized, and mainly it was federal monies to pay per capita for the provision of healthcare services in the states. Insured people under Seguro Popular had no option. They had to go to the state services, the public state services, to take advantage of this popular insurance. This lasted for 17 years, and January the 1st this year, this changed. A new institute was created, the National Institute for Health and Wellness, INSABI, the acronym in Spanish. And this is a dramatic change because this is a centralized provision. Everything is going to come back to the federal government, both financially and in terms of provision itself. And I'm going to talk plenty about this reform in SABI in a second. Social Security, mainly two institutes, IMSS and ISTE. This is also centralized provision. IMSS is for private employees, and ISTE is for government employees. Now, this, as I said, is the reform that we're going to be looking into, which is in SABI, this reform, January the 1st, President López Obrador. What's very interesting is that roughly 4 out of 10 Mexicans have health protection because they have Social Security. And 6 out of 10 Mexicans are uninsured. The problem is that Mexico spends most of its health funds in Social Security. Less people, more funds in Social Security, the largest share of the population uninsured, and a reduced amount of funds. Now, what I'm showing you is data from 2010 to 2020 per capita of these 3 institutions that provide healthcare to those with Social Security. So it's IMSS for private employees, ISTE for government employees, and Pemex, the oil Mexican company. Now notice that the highest per capita expenditure goes to Pemex, then IMSS and ISTE have roughly the same amount for the 2020 year. Now, what I'm going to show you now is the same per capita data for the institutions that provide healthcare for those uninsured. Notice that 2020, there's more than 1,000 Mexican pesos of difference. Notice also in time, the difference between IMSS and Seguro Popular has been reducing. That has to do with the extra funding that Seguro Popular was able to provide. However, there's still this difference. So we have the largest share of the population are uninsured, and we spend less money overall in these people compared to 4 out of 10 Mexicans having Social Security. So this is clearly unequal. Now, these monetary resources, of course, also express themselves in terms of other health resources. So here I'm going to show you hospital beds and health personnel per 100,000 inhabitants. This is data for 2018. Again, Social Security always does better. They have more financial resources, more material resources, more human resources, and in general, higher quality. So this is the first part of evidence regarding how in Mexico, healthcare protection is highly unequal in terms of subsystems. Now, going to move to regional inequalities, another layer of inequality. And this one has to do with, this evidence I'm going to show you, has to do with infant mortality rate. So the national data is 14.2 per 1,000 live births. If we look at the map, 32 states, it's a federal system, as I mentioned. If we look at Nuevo León, which is in the north, a very rich state overall, 10.2. But if we go to the southern part of Mexico, in Oaxaca, it has pretty much double the rate, infant mortality rate, which is constitution. Apparently, in the law, we have that everyone is protected the same. But we know that it depends on in which subsystem you have the fortune to fall into and where do you born, where do you live. Now, if we open this and we look at the states, we also see a large variation in within the states. So this is the third order of government, the third level of government in Mexico, municipal governments. And you can see that even in rich Nuevo León, we have a large variation in terms of infant mortality rates from 8.07 to 24.7. The same in Oaxaca, although the range is much larger. So it does make sense to have a decentralized healthcare provision, given these large differences in terms of needs. And I'm going to show you also in terms of resources across the states. This data is from 2017. It's state health expenditure for population without Social Security, those uninsured, as a percentage of public health expenditure. So what I'm going to show you very rapidly is that states contribute different amounts of resources to tend the health of uninsured people. So there's variation in needs, infant mortality rate, in conditions, and there's variation in the government effort to protect health for this population. Now, this is another evidence of very dramatic regional inequality, and this has to do with health personnel. Again, people without Social Security per 1,000 inhabitants. So large variation from Mexico City, where most of the high specialized hospital services are concentrated, to Nuevo León, which has a very low number of health personnel per 1,000 inhabitants. So large inequalities, both in terms of subsystems with Social Security, without Social Security, and in terms of the states and municipal territories. Now, what's surprising to me is that the health reform initiative that President López Obrador is pushing is a centralizing reform. So when he took office in December the 1st, 2018, he promised that we would have a universal health system, such as in Canada and in the Nordic countries. And he will prioritize poorer regions of the country, and he will guarantee free medical care and medicines. Later in the same month, he announced that Seguro Popular, popular insurance system, which I explained, and which has diminished the difference between Social Security system, no Social Security system, was going to disappear. And he used the word federalization, but in terms it means the centralization of states' health systems in the federal government. And this includes personnel, material resources, and all units providing health services, from the first level to very high specialty hospitals. Now, this started on January 1st this year. And what happened is that the federal government required state governments to sign agreements to coordinate the implementation of this new system. The agreement was that the healthcare services in each state were going to be funded jointly by federal and state governments. Mexico is a rather centralized country in terms of fiscal resources. So the federal government collects most taxes, and states depend, 80% of their income depends from federal transfers. So these coordination agreements meant that the states were going to manage the resources to guarantee the provision of comprehensive services, to maintain and develop infrastructure, and the state governments will be held accountable for all these tasks. Now, states had two options. They could keep the state health services, or they could give away those services to the federal government. And INSABI could provide the services in those states which did not sign. This is when things start to become a bit complicated. In terms of health personnel, INSABI promised that there were going to be a sufficient number of workers for the provision of services. Mexico is quite understaffed in terms of both physicians and nurses, quite dramatically. I can talk about that in the Q&A session. And also, if states accepted to give everything to INSABI, they would have to transfer these human, material, and financial resources. It is still unclear this day, in October, which is going to be the employment regime, including salaries and perks that these health workers are going to receive in the states. Workers do not know if they are going to be employees of the state government or of the federal government. Seguro Popular did hire lots of personnel, but they didn't hire them as regular workers, but as eventual workers. And this has caused problems, of course. Now, by August, but I can correct this to October the 10th, 2010, only 26 out of 32 states have decided to give away to another organization, operation, and supervision of the provision of services to the Federal New Institute, to INSABI. And 4 have decided not to give away these, 6, have decided not to participate into INSABI.
Professor Fleming, you have used up your time, but since the two gentlemen have saved 5 minutes, if they don't object, I would like to add their 5 minutes to you. So you will have 5 more minutes.
Thank you very much.
Agree,
I'm about
gentlemen?
to finish.
Okay, okay.
So about to finish. So today, INSABI is, I would say, is plagued by uncertainty. It has no operating rules. Patients do not know which benefits they are entitled to. They don't know if they are, like they were in Seguro Popular, covered for high complicated diseases such as cancer. It's not clear for health personnel if they have been regularized, who is the employer, if the state government or the federal government. And there's also uncertainty to state governments. No infrastructure and human resources have been signed just yet. And of course, still insufficient human resources that have not been hired just yet. Now, I don't have time to go over the COVID-19 thing, so I'll go very over this lack of coordination between the federal, state, and municipal governments, unfortunately. Problems with specific states that were willing to take further action to protect us from the pandemic. And I'll just finish up saying that what I try to show you is that it makes sense to have a decentralized healthcare protection system in Mexico, given the deep inequalities regarding regions. It also makes sense to create a universal healthcare system in Mexico, given, again, the severe inequalities derived from the subsystem, as I showed. And that this reform pushed forward by President López Obrador is characterized by centralization, which may create additional problems. It does not lead us to a universal healthcare system because INSABI is devoted only to people with no social security. So pretty much continues the previous problem of fragmentation that we had. Furthermore, the implementation of INSABI is filled with uncertainty, as I suggested. It even lacks operation rules. And that in this context of severe health crisis, severe economic crisis derived by COVID-19, this intersected with problems of coordination derived from the very centralized federal system that we have in Mexico, and the crisis also derived from the transition to INSABI. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Professor Flemmer, for your very comprehensive and very updated introduction to and discussion of the Mexican health system and its ongoing reform. And I'm personally, I actually I learned a lot from your presentation. And actually, I have two questions. Maybe we can discuss during the Q&A. First is actually you said the with regard to the uninsured population, the health system, you actually the system seems to me has undergone a kind of circle or spiral from centralized to from decentralized to centralized to decentralized and centralized again. So I'd like to know the rationale or driving force behind this kind of change or evolution. And second one is actually quite technical. When you talk about the inequality across the systems, you said the actually people without social security, they have fewer beds and medical personnel as compared to people with medical with social security. I'm a little confused based on my experience in China, because here in China, no matter you have or have not, you have or do not have medical social security or medical security, you have same access to medical resources. Just that when it comes to the allocation of the cost, that's different. So I'm a little confused about. I mean they have fewer beds and personnel. What does that mean? So maybe we can discuss that during the Q&A session. Now, first, okay, thank you for our three. Thanks to our three speakers for your presentation. And now, first, I will see if there are some questions from the audience. Not yet. So maybe we can start with our discussion. Maybe we start with Professor Liu, and during our discussion, I'll take care that any questions raised, I'll forward it to you.
Yeah. I firstly answer your question, Professor Liu.
What? My question?
Yeah, your question. I will answer your question.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
I remember you raised the question about the cooperation with the WHO and the WTO, MF, WIPO, and the other international organizations. I mean, you know, the epidemic control is not only the task of the WHO, because the control the epidemic need every country, every international organization to have a cooperate, because the health problem related to so many things, like the prevention materials, medicine, medical devices, and the vaccine. So from my view of points, international cooperation, especially on the international governance, is very, very important for the current COVID-19 control. So I suggest WHO should build a regular work program and mechanism with other organizations make the rule of law on the export and import of the very important materials, devices, and the futures the vaccine, aims to help other countries to control the epidemic. And we know WTO, you have said, faced a very difficult situation because the very big criticism from the United States, and the appellate body and members blocked by the United States. But I think European countries, China, Mexico, and other developing countries support multilateralism, support WTO's negotiation on the new rules. So I think only still have a chance. We have a chance to make rules on the export and import materials. But under the difficult situation, this task to the control the epidemic need the very close coordination between the WTO and the WHO. They should have a good negotiation on the import and export distribution of the vaccine and very important medical materials. So I think it's although we have a lot of difficulties, but we have to do these things in order to control the epidemic around the world. And other institution, the IMF is also very important for the current situation, because the IMF have the financial rules and the financial functions on the world trade and world investments. So just like what the other panelists cite, the balance between the economic recovery and the controlled epidemic is very difficult, but we look forward to the recovery of the world economy. So I think IMF and the WTO's cooperation is very, very important for the recovery of the world organization. So I think so. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Liu. Yeah, indeed, coordination and cooperation is necessary, and it's time to take action. Thank you, Professor Liu. Professor Cruz, would you like to share your insight?
Of course. About the question that Professor San asked, as I pointed out during my presentation, cash transfer provided by social programs, in case of Mexico, are necessary, but they have not to be considered as a temporary measures. Another important issue is the social protection system, which needs to be decided to ensure universal access to health and protection of the exercise of all social rights of Mexicans. In the case of Mexico, recovery is expected on specific economic areas, like the tourist sector. I think that debt strategy is only a last-instance action. In this regard, with the document consideration for the 2021 budgetary process, Coneval shows an analysis based on the evidence generated from studies and evaluations on social development programs and actions to provide useful useful findings and stakeholders related to decision-making from the confirmation of the expenditure budget of the Federation to 2021. Faced with the health pandemic caused by the COVID-19, we consider it necessary that the expenditure budget takes into account the programs and social development actions that may be relevant for the reduction of adverse effects on health, income, lack of access to basic housing service, and cash transfer programs linked to economic well-being, so that the integration of the budget strategic considerations considers social rights as a central element of government work in the current situation. That's my consideration about what is the necessary to do in the next months to front this great crisis by the COVID-19. Thank you. We cannot hear you, Professor Fan.
We cannot hear you, Professor Lia. We lost him again.
Maybe Professor Flaman, can you continue?
Yes. Well, unfortunately, he'll not. I think he comes. If not,
Hello?
We can hear you now, Professor.
Okay.
Would you like me to go over your questions or the question in the chat?
That's up to you, Professor Fleming.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your questions. I'll start with those. Regarding the centralization, decentralization movement, I would call it. Well, in fact, and I also added the dates, we started decentralizing health in Mexico in the 80s. So pretty much we had 40 years of decentralized healthcare services for uninsured people in Mexico, continuously with different emphasis maybe, but we had decided as a country to decentralize those services. And unfortunately, one of the effects of democratization in Mexico has been that the federal system has become very, very active, starting in the late 90s. And that meant that more and more responsibilities were given to state governments. And Seguro Popular meant a great influx of funds, of money to the state governments for healthcare, and it was not managed correctly at all times. So there have been several accusations of corruption in the system. At least one governor is in fact in jail because of these corruption problems. And given that the reform of López Obrador of centralizing is mainly pointed to finish up with those corruption problems. However, it seems to be that either you completely centralize or completely decentralize. But in my perspective, that's a false dilemma. In reality, you could decentralize some things, keep decentralized some areas of the healthcare system, and have more centralized control of financing practices. So to sum up my answer, I would say that we had decided, I consider it's the right choice, to decentralize as much as possible with very strict controls. And this problem also has to do with something I mentioned very rapidly during my talk, which is that the Mexican federal system is highly centralized in fiscal terms. So the federal government collects the taxes, and state governments are highly dependent on federal transfers to this day. 80% of the income for state governments comes from federal transfers. So that's the first question. The second question has to do with these rather confusing facts regarding how the healthcare subsystems operate. So if you are affiliated to IMSS, you are a formal private employee, you can only go to health clinics or to hospitals of IMSS. You cannot go to Seguro Popular or ISTE or any other system but your own system. And given the fact that those healthcare services for the uninsured have been historically underfunded, that's what explains that they have less resources, material resources, less human resources. That has to do with something I also mentioned in this graph, in which I said we spend as a country the largest share of our healthcare funds for people in social security, disregarding the fact that the largest share of the population is in fact uninsured. That's why we are in sore need of creating a universal healthcare system in Mexico, like the one you described in China, in which you can go to any public health service, even if you are Chinese, or in this case, if you are Mexican. And just to finish up, thank you very much for the question in the chat. The question is, to what extent is the COVID-19 pandemic affecting the reform process launched by the current AMLO administration? And I would say it has been sorely affected. It has been affected because of the economic crisis created by COVID-19. Federal monies and state government monies as well are diminishing, and thus we have even less resources to tend to those both uninsured and uninsured subsystems. On top of that, the projections of loss of employment are mostly formal employments. That means that less people are going to have social security, and thus the new system in Savi is going to be more demanding than it used to be at the beginning of the year. So what I would say to sum up is that COVID-19 is magnifying the inequalities both across subsystems and across regions.
Thank you very much, Professor Palermo. Now we have not received a new question so far. So are you speakers do you like to have some discussion among yourselves now before new questions coming in?
Yeah. Professor Liu, may I raise the question to the medical colleagues?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for our colleagues to share your very important knowledge and information about the Mexican health system and reform and advance to control the epidemic. My question is about how about the situation about now the current control epidemic in Mexico, and in your country, how to balance the human rights protection and the restriction of the distancing and the control the gathering and other stricter measures to control the epidemic. Yeah, the question for both of you, if you like.
Maybe if you agree, Professor Flaman, please.
Sure. Well, again, I'm going to say, to use the same word, COVID-19 has magnified the problems of the Mexican government or the Mexican state overall. So we have a fragile health system, and this has we have an understaffed health system that has been severely strained by the pandemic. And on top of that, we have a very severe problem, as you know, of violence associated with drug trafficking, unfortunately. So it's very difficult for the federal or state governments to ask police officers if we had imposed very strict measures like they did in other countries. Unfortunately, we don't have a very professional police force which could enforce those strict measures and at the same time protecting human rights. So if we know, we're aware of problems in countries with much more professionalized police forces, like in France, in Argentina, where there were complaints regarding human rights. In the Mexican case, that was very complicated. Now, another severe problem that we have, if I may comment on this as well, is that 6 out of 10 people in Mexico work in what is called the informal economy. They are street vendors. They may work in a formal company, but they are not hired as formal employees. That means that if people were locked down today, they didn't have income to provide for themselves and their families next week, right? Or the following day. They have daily income that allows them to survive or to live a decent style of life, but depending on their daily income or their weekly income. So it was decided not to impose the strict measures regarding the lockdown because the government was afraid that these people were going to have very severe problems regarding their income, the daily sustenance, let me call it like that. Now, that's, again, quite complicated because these people are the most vulnerable people. And unfortunately, the majority of deaths have occurred precisely in this segment of the population that couldn't stop, couldn't do telework, couldn't protect themselves requesting food to be delivered at home. They had to go out to work to sustain themselves. And they are unfortunately the most affected by the disease. So as I started saying, the COVID-19 pandemic has again magnified the weaknesses, unfortunately, of the Mexican government at all levels.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So it's clear we had a social economic problem in the case of Mexico. This sanitary control is what is causing deeper economic difficulties. According to a geographic system that Coneval developed the last months, we can identify that 80% of cases are in urban areas. And obviously, reopening has been necessary for informal economic, like the Professor Flaman says. The problem here is to have more economic resource. Simple, but I think a powerful conclusion is that we need right now, the government needs to spend better and spend smart. So it's very necessary the coordination of the 3 government branches. Coordinate measures are required on the 3 government levers, getting involved to promote that households that could have income difficulties and can satisfy the most basic needs. So the coordination between municipality, state, and the government federal is very necessary. So the expected in the future, it's Mexico can be recovery not only the economic sectors. So it's necessary in the future we can recover all the social and poverty indicators that we can up in the last month.
Yeah, thank you for your very good introduction. From my eyes, every countries have to face the very difficult situation now. But I think that the difficulty is different depending on the culture and the social system and the other things. Like China, you know, we have a very disciplined people. So most people, most population of China have a strong willing to abide by the very strict restriction made by the Chinese government. So we have now make a very strong measures to recover our economy, and at the same time we have to keep our minds in order to prevent some areas the epidemic recovery. So it's very difficult, to be honest, for the Chinese government and Chinese people. But we have made a very strong, very strong. We locked down the Wuhan, you know, we locked down the very big city and the very most population in the Wuhan. But our government make a very difficult decision to lock down at the early time of the COVID-19. So thank you for your introduction. I can feel your country's difficult, same as the Chinese government and Chinese people. We have the same difficult situation, but although it's different because just as I said, the different culture, different social system, different economy, and other things. But I think we have to have a strong cooperation between the China and Mexico to cope with the very difficult situation in the recovery of economy, in the prohibition, the restriction, travels restriction, and distribution of the futures vaccine. You know, we have some new vaccines for the COVID-19, maybe until the end of this year. So Chinese government has a promise to distribute the vaccine to the developing country. So although we have a very difficult situation, but I believe we have a very bright future. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Where's our moderator? Yeah, Laura.
Yeah, he's writing in the chat that he has a very unstable internet connection, unfortunately. Maybe we could close Professor Liu with a few words of you talking about the World Health Organization and what are the challenges that the organization is facing with this pandemic and the pandemics that are coming along.
I'm sorry. I respond to my telephone. Yeah.
I was saying that maybe we can close up the panel with a few words of you talking about the World Health Organization and the challenges it's going to face with this pandemic and the forthcoming pandemics, unfortunately.
Yeah. Just like I referred in my speech, WHO is very important. They should play a very important role, especially in current difficult situation. But you know, the WHO has to face the same difficulties. You know, the criticism and blamed by the United States, and so I think they are very difficult. But WHO, just like I have said, should be reformed and strengthen their rule of law, their health governance. I think their task is very important. They should reform and make new rules on the international health governance as soon as possible. Yeah, welcome the moderator. Come back again. We have.
I'm sorry, I mean, this connection is killing me. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, really sorry for that. Okay, many thanks for these wonderful presentations and for this actually very interesting and this very insightful Q&A session. Actually, this is one of the best Q&A session I have experienced. Although I lost contact with you for a few minutes. So I'm very glad that we can have this chance to share our knowledge and experience and our understanding of the situation of the pandemic, of the healthcare, of the international rule of law, and above all, the importance of close cooperation between China and Mexico. So I thank you very much, my colleagues, for your input, and I already look forward to another gathering, whether on the web or on spot.
they stop. Yeah. Maybe we wait for a minute. I suggest if you have a chance in the near future, welcome to China. Welcome to our institute. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Liu.
Yeah, maybe several years ago, I have visited your very beautiful country, invited by the Mexican University. We have a very good and very warm discussions on the WTO law and trade rules and free trade zone between the China and Mexico. So I have some very good friends in your country. Yeah.
You're of course very welcome to visit us as well, both at the National University. I'm sure Professor Cruz would subscribe that, and of course at El Colegio de Mexico at Colmex. You're very much welcome. I also had the opportunity to go to China a couple of years ago, and
really? Which city?
I went to Shanghai and to Beijing, and it was
Hong Kong, Shanghai. Shanghai.
Yeah.
Shanghai.
Fascinating country. Very impressed by the large universities.
You should visit our institute. I invite you to have a speech and a presentation to our colleagues and our students.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah. How about Cruz? You have to visit China?
No, not yet. But Professor, you are very welcome to come to the NAM here in Mexico, and obviously here in Coneval. And maybe thank you, Professor Flaman, Professor Liu, for sharing your interesting presentation. And obviously, thank you to the organizers and the audience for the attention. I think that we are close the panel right now, but I want to say good night here in Mexico. Good morning to China. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Thank you. I believe Professor Cruz, you will have a chance to visit China.
Thank you. Of course. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Hasta luego, mucho gusto.
Igualmente.
Gracias.